Welcome to PolyInnovator Gaming. So this is the first Poly content episode that's not on the main TeleInnovator channel, and so that's very weird to me. And so I'm actually recording this also, just kind of as a plug, with the vertical plugin. So some of you are watching on the YouTube channel, so it's horizontal video, and some of you might be watching on TikTok, which means it's vertical. And so I'm going to try to keep it short enough to where it could fit on both platforms just fine, but this episode is purely around Zelda, actually. And so today we're going over this top 10 Zelda games that are basically just my personal favorites. And so I thought maybe doing a slideshow might be a good idea, but I figured just going through the blog post might also be well. So one thing I want to mention as well is that this is on the new website I created for PolyInnovator Gaming on its own. So even though PolyInnovator is my holistic personal brand, PolyInnovator Gaming is like a subset of that. It's just like my swimming is, but a little bit even more isolated because I have its own website, YouTube, and Instagram. So please go check those out. And so this episode really is weird for me because I'm not used to doing Poly content outside of my regular little places, but I figured this particular topic, which was on my list to do, would be perfect for this particular channel. Now, many of you may not be Zelda fans, most of us are. It's one of those game series that just really hits home with you, can really kind of get to your core, and even though the plots can often be very simple, very hero's journey kind of tropes, it really does give you a twist here and there, and not really the gameplay itself really speaks for the game rather than the story. And so I love the series. I love the different trials and tribulations that Link has to face in order to become that hero. That's the reason why he's the embodiment of the Triforce of Courage. And I find that this list is going to be a little controversial because most people are not necessarily going to agree with the order of what I picked. And I think that that's going to be different because there's a lot of top 10 Zelda game lists out there. And I wanted to make something unique. Now, if you're watching on TikTok, you'll notice how the text is a little bit maybe just too small to read. That is okay. I'm going to try to voice it out, most of it at least, and so don't worry about having to read it. If you want to go read it, just go check out the website. You can read the blog post there. On the blog post, I'll have linked the video and polycast version of this episode because that's what poly content means. The poly content is just doing all three in one, so written, audio, and video content together. All right, here's the list. So the first one right off the bat is going to be Little Legend of Zelda, the very first game. Now, I think that having a list without having the original game on there would be a shame, and the fact that I have it as number 10 is kind of controversial because of just how much of the OG that it is. It laid the groundwork for all the games to come after that, and Breath of the Wild modeled its gameplay and overworld based off of the original game because they both were open world, which is kind of weird to think about how in the 80s that there was an open world Zelda game, but that's really what it was. You got to go anywhere you want. You could skip to like basically one of the later dungeons if you wanted to too. Now, when it comes to the next game, again, this one should be up higher on the list, but I find that I don't really care for it as much. Like, I loved playing it. I love seeing the randomizer stuff, and I love Link to the Past. That's what the game is, but it's the GOAT. It's the OG too, just like the original Legend of Zelda. This is one of the OG ones in the series. It laid the blueprint of the Zelda series. 3 dungeons, go to a new world, have about 5 dungeons after that. That's literally the pattern. That's what everyone has been doing, and whenever it comes to the factor of how does a Zelda game play out? Besides Breath of the Wild, they always follow that same format, 3 then 5 usually. And there's always that dual world concept. So in Link to the Past, you had the Dark World, then in Skyward Sword, you had the Sky and Hyrule, and then in like what's the other one? Twilight Princess, you had the Twilight Realm. So there's different ways of viewing it. I guess even in Skyward Sword, you had the Spirit Realm too. Next is Age of Calamity. So Age of Calamity is interesting because it's higher on the list, but why? It's a spin-off, right? Why is it higher than the OGs? Well, the story is just phenomenal, and there's voice acting too now, which is just crazy. And it's honestly crazy it took them this long to do it, though. But the fact that Age of Calamity had such a powerful story, like, I got engrossed into the heroic feeling of being Link and Zelda fighting against Ganon. And I honestly think that the final fights in Age of Calamity was better than Breath of the Wild. And so it was actually a little bit harder too, no less. And just having the champions there with you fighting against, and I guess minor spoilers because it's kind of in the trailers for the most part, but having the champions with you in the world, being able to play as the champions, it kind of almost gave me the feeling of Majora's Mask when you get to play as all the different people. So I wonder if we'll get another Majora's Mask in the future where you get to play as the champions more in a Breath of the Wild style world. Next, Majora's Mask. So with Majora's Mask, it's interesting because a lot of times it is higher on the list. But why is that? So in Majora's Mask, you have this deep, engrossing story that's often based on the stages of grief, maybe unofficially. People always have that theory that it's based off, like, denial, anger, depression, that kind of thing. But honestly, even if it's not based on that, the actual world that they've built was so lived in and so real that that's all that really matters. Like, yes, there's that theme of depression and stages of grief, but the theme of just helplessness, that's really what they were trying to go for, and I think that they really nailed that home. I'm kind of surprised that they would go so depressing with the Zelda game, but Nintendo is not as child-friendly as a lot of people seem to think it is, and that's okay. Next is Oracle Ages and Seasons. Now, when it comes to these series, every freaking list, including my own here, puts them together. Now, I do want to say that, like, Oracle of Ages is probably 6 and Seasons is 6. No, wait. It's probably like 5.5, if you will. Like, it's a little bit higher up on the list. I prefer Seasons over Ages because the Seasons has more gameplay, it's more combat, whereas Ages is more puzzle. And so it's one of those things where I'm not much more of a puzzle guy. My roommate is. He likes Ages more than Seasons, and me vice versa. So preferably I have Seasons a little bit higher, but since they are technically together linked, I figured putting them together on the list is probably okay. Honestly, though, too, like, that Game Boy style, like, it hits home. I want to make my own Game Boy game. In fact, one of the things that I was doing before I was working on Phase Evos was actually trying to get a practice run, if you will. I wanted to make a Zelda-like game using GB Studio, and I still might. At this point, I kind of put it off the side burner, but I was going to make a Zelda-like Game Boy game in GB Studio, and I made my own little region. I actually started collecting assets for it, and I think I'm going to eventually do it, but it's really interesting how, like, I really love that style. Next is Wind Waker, and a lot of people would definitely have this higher up on the list, but I don't think I want to. It's one of those things where I feel that Wind Waker is incomplete. And when I played it, it just wasn't as good as I had envisioned it to be. I kind of avoided it for a while, and it had nothing to do with the art style. To me, art style is important. I need good graphics. But I considered the graphics of Wind Waker to be stylized. Like, I don't remember even when I was younger dissing on the graphical style of Wind Waker. It was what it was, if you will. And so even as a young person, I was like, the graphics look good. It's its own little style, sure, but I don't need it to be realistic. I like realistic more, which is probably why I preferred Twilight Princess, but I still enjoyed Wind Waker's art style. It eventually took me a while to actually get around to playing it, though, because I just never really cared for the story. I was spending a lot of time on the Zelda Wiki when I was a teenager, and I ended up reading a lot of the story of Wind Waker, and it kind of ruined me when it came to, like, actually wanting to play it. But eventually, I got access to a Wii U, and I started playing it. And this was a while back, but I don't know, just the way that they cut things out and the way that it progresses just didn't feel right to me. Next is Minish Cap. So Minish Cap is one of those games where, again, people usually put it lower on the list and have Wind Waker higher, but I find that Minish Cap was better made. Like, yes, it was made by Capcom, and that's kind of sacrilegious to say, but I think Capcom did a good job. Just like with Oracle Ages and Seasons, they made a unique world, they made it different, they made it seem cohesive and lived in. For a Game Boy, it's a really impressive feat, and so I find that being able to have that kind of style of gameplay is really important. Next is Twilight Princess, which is a really interesting game where you honestly have this kind of feeling of just like, man, overwhelm. That's the best way to describe it, where you're like, can I actually defeat this evil? And honestly, too, just the graphics were top tier. I love having that realistic style just because it made the world feel more big. It made it feel more real, obviously, because it's realistic. Breath of the Wild, again, I say this in the post, if I made this post like before 2021, I probably would have had it first because I was still on that hype train that everyone else was on when it came to Breath of the Wild. But honestly, it's not as good as we made it out to be. I guess you could consider it a masterpiece, like a lot of people were saying, but I honestly would probably rate it 9 out of 10, which is what I did here, is 9 out of 10, because honestly, it has a lot of things going for it and a lot of things it needs to fix. I'm not a fan of the dungeons. I don't want the same copy-pasted style for each dungeon. I want a nice, unique, artistic style per dungeon. Sure, they were different, but divine beasts, and they played differently, like the bird versus the camel, completely different, but it just still felt like the same place over and over and over again, and the shrines were just you get burned out on them quickly. And I beat all the shrines eventually. I had to have my roommate help me find them all, but it was one of those things where I wish there was more to it. And I guess now the video is too long for TikTok, so I'm gonna have to put it on IG Reels or IGTV. Lastly, we have the top dog, which is Ocarina of Time. Now, of course, this has to be in the top. It's on the top of most best games of the world, let alone best Zelda games. And I think that none of these games really come close to the story, the dungeons, and the music all in one. Some games will have like the gameplay be top tier. Some games have the best music. Some games have the best story, but they might not all come together in a full package. Now, while Ocarina of Time may not have the best music or the best dungeons, although I think they're pretty high up on the list, I think the fact that it has the highest quality of all of them together compared to like how some games have high here, low here, it's more even level for all of them. That's why it makes it the top tier. Now, this is a simple post. I'm not used to making top 10 posts, and so if you want to read more, I have my PolyInnovator Gaming website here. It's literally just, I'll probably have a link so you can actually check it out, but it's paragraph.xyz at PolyInnovator. It is a blockchain platform based on Web3, which is why I have it on here. So I figured at some point it'd give me a little bit of future proofing, and I have a few posts on here already, and I'm going to keep trying to post every week. So please go check it out. I hope you enjoy. I hope this video recorded well, because having the vertical and horizontal at the same time is a little bit weird, but I'm enjoying it. Speaking of which, I want to plug in that plugin. It's Vertical by Atem and Harris Heller. They were working on having, like, basically you have two screens. You have your horizontal one and your vertical one, and it has a separate recording to it as well. I could even click and make a TikTok out of it, and I'm just sitting here in awe on how I'm able to do that together at the same time. So please subscribe, like, and peace out.